forest reference levels in the context of REDD+. Before we get started with the presentations, I'd like to introduce our various panelists and presenters who prepared presentations for us today. I would like first to thank Ms. Donna Lee, who recorded the introduction on forest reference levels that you may have looked at before this webinar. It was a very comprehensive introductions to forest reference levels in the context of REDD+. The link was sent on YouTube. If you haven't watched it yet, we highly recommend you do so. It's a very good basic 101 crash course on reference level. Donnelly is an international expert on climate policy. And if you want to know more about her work and her expertise, her biography appears on your screen right now. And now I'd like to introduce the panelists we have live with us. They all appear on the screen as well. First, I'd like to introduce Sandro Federici. Sandro has about 15 years of experience as a consultant and technical expert in reporting and accounting for greenhouse gas emissions and removals in the land sector, including forestry and REDD+, with several international organizations, including the FAO, the IPCC, and the UNFCCC. He has extensive experience as a consultant on negotiations under the UNFCCC, both for REDD+ and the LULUCF sector, with delegations of Italy, the European Community, Papua New Guinea, and Panama. Second, I'd like to introduce Lucio Santos. Lucio provides technical support on national forest monitoring system and forest reference levels in Latin America for the UNREDD program at FAO. He's an experienced professional on issues related to forest monitoring, REDD+, climate change, and program management, and also used to participate to REDD+ negotiations under the UNFCCC. Then I'd like to introduce Ms. María José Sanz Sánchez, the UNREDD team leader here at FAO. Maria provides supports to countries on national forest monitoring system and their participation in REDD+. Maria formerly served as senior officer at the UNFCCC Secretariat, leading the support for negotiations on LULUCF, agriculture, and REDD+. I'd also like to introduce Mr. Eric Lindquist. Eric Lindquist is a remote sensing expert providing support to countries in satellite imagery processing, land cover map creation, and providing accurate forest area change estimate. He does cutting edge research on time series analysis for degradation and contributed on this topic to the GFOI MGD. And I'd like to introduce Ms. Marieke Sanker. Marieke is an expert on forest reference levels for REDD+ under the UNFCCC, providing support to countries under the UNREDD program here at FAO. She's the lead author of two key publications of the UNREDD program on forest reference levels published by FAO in 2014 and 2015. And finally, a short presentation about myself. I am Philippe Crête. I'm regional advisor for the UNREDD program to the Africa region. I'm also the team leader on forest reference level for the UNREDD program here at FAO. Now that we've introduced all the panelists, we would like to know slightly better about the audience. Where you're from, which region, and I guess what sort of institution you are part of. And on your screen you will see 3 different polls with questions. Take a look at the little box left under what country you work in. You'll be able to click from a drop-down menu And also tick the boxes of the sector you work in and the region you work in. We'll wait a few seconds, and then we'll provide an overview to everyone of the results. Okay, so in total we have about 27 participants with us. About half of the participants are government representatives. The other half are members from international organizations, and we also have 2 people from the private sector. Most people in the virtual room are from Asia and Africa, and we also have representatives from South America, North and Central America, as well as Europe and Oceania. So with no further ado, we will move on to our first presentation by Ms. María José Sanz Sánchez, after which we will open for questions. And then we'll move on to the broader general questions that some countries sent in advance to this webinar. So just so you know, you can make the presentation full screen by bringing your pointer to the top right of the presentation, and you'll see the options to make it full screen.
Good morning, everyone. Indeed, my presentation is going to be an introduction. I won't try to go into details of the construction and submission of the reference levels, but rather try to make you, in a nutshell, what FAO is trying to do to support countries on this area and in which context. So basically, we do that in the context of supporting you on construction of the reference level and submission under the UNFCCC, meaning that we try to support you on how those decisions can be followed and respected and implemented in the construction. So we do build on your country capacity. We think it's important that whatever capacity is there is the basis for building more capacity and constructing the reference level. That will allow for more resilient capacity to stay in the country and to improve in the future. Of course, we think it's important that you understand and adhere to the UNFCCC guidance, while at the same time, what you are doing, constructing your reference level, is relevant for your domestic needs and actions. So we will support you if you want to submit the reference level, but we also will support you if you want to have your reference level for your domestic purpose in the context of the sector, of a broader objectives. What we do basically is providing technical support. As you know very well, there are 4 elements that were established in the Cancun agreements that you have to sort of build in your country in order to access resource-based payments for supporting your REDD actions in the context of the UNFCCC means of support. Those are your national strategy, which basically is how you think in terms of REDD and what sort of plans and actions you may envision in order to reduce emissions, enhance things. You will have to sort of archive and organize your information related to safeguards, and this is called a system SIS, or System on Information on Safeguards in this context. And there are other two elements which are relevant for the discussion of today. One is your National Forest Monitoring System, which is where you gather the information you need, either for the construction of the reference level, so gathering information from the past, basically, or on the estimation of the actual reductions or enhancements that you will have as a result of your REDD activities. And of course, the reference level, which is the core of the discussion today, which is something that you have to construct in order to compare and understand if your actions on REDD+ are indeed making the impact that you are expecting. And on the basis of this impact, you will be rewarded. And that's why the reference level becomes a centerpiece of REDD+. Those are guided by these decisions that you see there, but basically in the case of reference levels, you have three decisions. One early decision that was for CP15 that was indicating some initial guidance for demonstration activities, and in this context give you some ideas about what the reference level is. And then two decisions, one of the submission and one of the on the assessment process of the reference level. And that's, again, the guidance that we will focus on. Next. In decision 11 CP19, I guess the most important message there is that obviously it has to be, your information should be suitable for being assessed and for MRVU results. Yeah. And then, of course, there are other decisions like 14 CP19 that it tells you that you have to have a consistent. I mean, when you estimate what is the impact of your REDD activities, what you compare with and the result of what you are doing in this period of time where the activities are happening, it has to be comparable, and therefore it has to be consistent. So the information you use for your reference level and the information you use to measure your performance in the period where the activities are having an impact, it has to be done with consistent methodologies, consistent data sets, and so on. Right, and then, well, decision 12 CP17, you get some guidance on how to construct. And there, one of the main messages is you are not starting from scratch. I mean, you have done some exercises on the sector of LULUCF through your national forest, through national greenhouse gas inventory, sorry. And therefore, you have to look back to this information that was submitted through your greenhouse gas inventory, and then see if you're going to construct your reference level, what you want to put new, what you want to improve, and if this creates inconsistencies with the greenhouse gas inventory, you have to explain that or be aware of that. It is happening that the greenhouse gas inventory sometimes were done very early in time, where we didn't have any idea about that we were going to construct reference levels for REDD. And now you have also a process for constructing new or for building new greenhouse gas inventories, improving them in the context of the BORs. So we can speak a little bit later about how this in time fits and what problems you may face. But in general, the message is that you have to look for consistency, and if you don't have it now, it has to be definitely be built as soon as possible. Everyone understands more or less barely what a reference level is for, right? It's, as I said before, you have some emissions in the past, you are going to do something, and this something is going to hopefully reduce your emissions, and if you you have in mind, so even enhance your sinks. And therefore you need something to compare with to show that this is in reality happening. So this is the concept behind. So it's a benchmark for assessing your performance or after the implementation of your REDD activities. So as I said before, I mean, those are the key decisions that we will look for and we will find guidance on. the initial decision that was on methodologies before Cancun. It has some good messages there, like transparency, which is a very important message in the context of how you deal with information in the UNFCCC. And it's been always the very important idea that the historic data are very relevant. But of course, also, in some cases, there are some national circumstances that may need to be sort of embedded or used for adjusting the historic data. I mean, obviously, the magnitude or the unit is CO2 equivalent tons per year. It is, as I said, has to be consistent with the greenhouse gas inventories. That's very important. But also, you have to be aware that it's nothing that you need to do perfect from the beginning per se, but you can construct a stepwise path on how to improve from an initial reference level and how to move towards a much more better, inclusive, even in the scope, in the scale, if you want, or even methodologically speaking. And of course, there is guidance on what type of information should be in the submission, an annex of one of the decisions that you see here. And there is a very important guidance also for the assessment process, so for the experts that will assess the reference level. And this is the most recent decision that was adopted in Warsaw, which is the 13th. So what are the elements that you have to reflect? Let's go to substance a little bit. The elements you have to reflect on, obviously, is with the scale you're starting. We all know that REDD aims, and the goal is to reach national scale. But of course, it may not be possible from the beginning, and therefore, it was certain allowance. Okay, someone is out. It was certain allowance for starting in an interim basis some national level. We all know that, but this requires certain thinking about how you will move to national later on, because otherwise you may have difficulties. Then on the scope, I mean, you can select activities. There are 5 activities. We can discuss, if you want, about the character of the activities. You obviously probably are being facing the problem that they are not exactly mutually exclusive. They have some potential overlaps. Some of them are can overlap or can happen in the same unit of land and so on. And then the other element that you have to think about is, okay, what's your forest? And this has to be defined from the beginning. So you need to have upfront what is your forest definition. You have to reflect about why you have this forest definition, how your forest was defined before, and what definitions are being submitted in your greenhouse gas inventory, in other processes as well. Particularly, for example, it's always very, very important to compare to the FAO definition that you're using. And if you use another one, you have to explain why. What are the reasons for that? And then on the data you have to use. So what are the data you have to construct the reference level? How this data will relate later on the data you're collecting for measuring your performance. And all these has to be collected, taking into account IPCC guidance that are already there. You have to look at least the 2003 GPG, because that is where there is the most recent guidance upgraded later on by the 2006 guidance. So you can choose or you can select either way. And then, of course, the construction methodology is something you also have to reflect. And it will be very much linked to what sort of historic data you have. And of course, if you think that this data needs to be adjusted because of your national circumstances, and what are your national circumstances. But this requires some reflection before you decide or you make your mind up as a final decision. Next. Okay, so that's basically the introduction we wanted to make. This is the frame in which we are going to have the other presentations, the example of Giacomo, and we hope that you can ask questions in this context. And I hope this is how to structure the webinar.
Okay, thank you so much, Maria Jose. Now, we will first start answering some of the questions that were sent in advance. If you recall, with the invitations to the webinar, we asked you to send questions in advance, to which we prepared answer as a group. And we will run quickly through those questions. The name of the countries that sent questions appear on the screen. Would like to thank you for your contribution. This is very helpful. And so we'll go through these questions first and have a little bit of interaction between the panelists. After which, you know, you have the chat box. You'll be able to ask other questions, additional questions or clarifications on the questions we will run through now. We won't likely be able to answer all the questions, but we will try to consolidate the most common ones and provide you an opportunity after the webinar to pose your questions in email. So let's first dig in the first questions, and I guess it's up to me to answer on this one, and I get the easy one. So I've been asked, well, we've been asked how have other countries constructed their FREL so far. There are already various examples, and they vary quite a bit. You might be aware that the UNREDD program prepared a publication to summarize different approaches to FREL by various countries. The publication was released last year. You can have a look. The internet link appears on the screen. It includes 10 examples of FRELs. They are mainly for subnational demonstration activities, not in the context of the UNFCCC, but most of the countries you'll find in these publications are contenders to the FCPF Carbon Fund. But there is also a description of Brazil's approach or submission to the UNFCCC, as well as Guyana's approach in the context of their bilateral agreement with Norway. So we invite you to read through those examples, and you'll see there's clearly a variety of different examples emerging in various REDD+ countries. And also, you could have a look at the UNFCCC website, where there's already 6 submissions available of countries that have submitted their FREL to the UNFCCC. Now, we're not going to run through these examples today, but we do invite you to consult these examples, and we do hope that you'll learn a lot from those. So now let's move to the second questions. And I guess, Marike, you're up.
Let me take that question. So several countries, and we have formulated this into one single question, but there were several countries that were asking us, so how do I construct a reference level? What steps have to be taken? So as Maria already mentioned in her presentation, there are several elements that a country needs to develop or needs to take decisions on. And basically, these elements, the way we see it, are influenced or informed by 2 big things. So first of all, the information gathered through your National Forest Monitoring System. This will tell you something about the current level of emissions from the forest and possibly about a trend. And on the other side, what we think is important to consider is what is the national strategy about, which activities are targeted by this national strategy, or it may influence the scale. For example, if you start at provincial scale, you may first submit a subnational reference level. Now, these linkages are not necessarily as strict as we show right here. I mean, there may be some data limitations. If only data is available for one province, then the National Forest Monitoring System may actually determine the scale. There are other linkages possible as well. There could be linkages between the strategy and the forest definition, because setting the forest definition will include different woodlands, for example, if those are important for your strategy. So the way we see it in this graph is that the analysis of historical data together with an analysis of national circumstances will, first of all, could feed back into the national strategy. This information can help you formulate the strategy, not necessarily. But these are the two main ingredients, so to say, to choose a construction approach. And from there, we have all the elements together in a reference level. Now, all of these steps and some technical considerations around these are described in a publication which just came out online yesterday. Here you can find the link to that document, to the download of the PDF. We will send around the link later, and it will be shortened a little bit. It's a very long link right now. But for those of you who already want to have a look, if you click this link, you will download the PDF of the technical considerations for forest reference level construction for REDD+ under the UNFCCC. I will now move on to the next slide, but we will share the link with you shortly.
So this is a question about the fact if the protected areas should be considered in the reference level in all countries. As a matter of fact, not all countries till now that have submitted the reference level have included the protected area. This is up to the country, of course, to decide if to include or not the protected areas. The expectation is that when you do a reference level, when you implement REDD activities, you do those at a large scale at the regional level, if not already at the national level. And to exclude some portion of the area, of the region, of the country, always then rise the issues of displacement of emissions. That is also a complication for your national forest monitoring system. So generally, my personal advice is to include those areas. Of course, the opposite, to include only those areas, to not include the rest of the forest land is also quite, maybe is more odd than including them, because the protected areas are already subject to special, specific management activities for forest conservation. So the additionality of implementing a REDD+ looks, it maybe is not there if only the protected areas are included. I guess I covered it unless somebody else.
Okay, thanks, Philippe. Well, regarding degradation, I can divide the answer in two parts. The first one is to emphasize that the rationale on how to design a reference level for degradation follow the same steps mentioned before on the Maria's presentation, and applicable for all the activities in the framework of REDD+. It means specify the forest definition, define the scope, activities, pools and gases, scale, and identifying historical data, analysis of historical data and national circumstances. So on the second part, is true that there are some challenges regarding degradation. For example, for most of countries, the appropriate information and methodologies are missing. However, in the frame of submission before of UNFCCC for technical assessment, a description of possible ways as can be addressed by the country, providing an indication of what countries plans to do to include degradation in the future, and a rough assessment, for example, of historical degradation emission with some proxy data that could be available in the country may be useful to satisfy, for example, the technical assessment process. I think that this one the important considerations when the countries think in the issue of degradation.
Okay, well, the next question is what will be the likely suggestions from UNFCCC or IPCC regarding how to combine regional or project level RELs into national level? Well, my first reaction to this is that there is no guidance on that, because the focus of the UNFCCC is on the national reference levels, allowing for an interim subnational reference level. So I will say that you will have to find ways to do that in a manner that is easy. It allows to use the information you have in your national forest monitoring system, and won't create problems when, in the case of subnational, for example, you just go and towards an increased area looking for a national. But in the subnational case, you can combine subnational reference levels, but you have to think very carefully from the beginning what methodologies you would like to use, because you will have to look for some consistency in there. The problem that you may have is, well, first of all, like Sandro said before, for the other question, if you go for subnational, immediately it is the issue of displacement rise. But it's also potentially, when you combine different reference levels on subnational level, it could have some problems of double accounting if you are not careful. But again, the displacement is also an issue, at least in the case until you reach the national level. So you could be asked about that. So I think it is not a problem to have subnational reference levels combined, or to have a national reference level which is a combination of several reference levels, as far as its consistency. On the regional, and I suppose regional for you means beyond the national boundaries, well, it's up to you. I mean, if you want a regional reference level, you will have to detract your national reference level from that number, because your obligations are related to your country boundaries, either a national or subnational level to start with. So I would say there's nothing against having a regional reference level, but your obligations are on your boundaries. So you will have to decouple from there the national number. And that's, I think, all we can say at this point in time.
Next.
Yes, thank you. On the next question, on some examples to useful forest reference level approaches in a high forest cover low deforestation context. We can say that, first of all, according with relevant decision of the COP, countries in establishing reference level may adjust for national circumstances in accordance with the guidance from the COP. Then, if an upwards adjustment is proposed, a country should provide details on the national circumstances and a rationale to justify the adjustment. It's very important to provide all the information used for the adjustment. This information should be transparent, complete on the way that allow the reconstruction of reference level by the technical team assessment, for example, and this information should be consistent and accurate also. Some of the examples that are available right now as different approach to adjust is the submissions from Guyana and Colombia. These countries has proposed an adjustment to their reference level, and in the frame of FCPF, Republic of Congo, for example, has proposed also an adjustment based for its reference emission level.
Okay, thank you, Lucio. Then one last question before we open the floor to clarifications or additional questions.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, how many forest cover changes estimate are needed for development of reference level per country? You don't have guidance on that. I mean, what is obviously necessary is that what you construct is robust enough and represents a good benchmark for assessing performance. So therefore, it will depend on the construction approach you have. It will depend on if you rely on an historical average because you think that in this period of time, the historical average represents very well what happened, and therefore is a good benchmark. And how many dots you need in there, it will depend on how much oscillations you have in this historical period, so that you can reflect a good average. So it is a very sort of flat thing. Well, with a few points may be enough. If you see that there are some sorts of trends ups and downs, you may need a longer or more number of dots. I mean, but that's basic statistics, so that's not a secret. Obviously, if you want to reflect a trend or you want to do a projection, you will need more dots in order to make a robust basis for the projection and even the adjustments to be done on that number. So I would say that it will depend on your circumstances. But obviously, I mean, I would say that 2, it's probably too little. Even if you have a very flat reference in the past, at least 3 in order to show that this is not anything that goes up and down too much. And if you detect there is changes, then you probably will need to think about improving. But always, you don't feel bad if you don't have that much. I mean, you always can enrich those points as soon as you improve your reference level. So try to be as robust as you can with the resources and information you have. That will be, I think, the advice.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Now we're opening up the chat box for more general questions. I guess we'll take a few, and then we will move on to the second presentation. We already have one question, and I'll open up the floor to the panelists. So FRELs may not cover all forest areas. While the greenhouse gas inventory for the LULUCF sector is done in a way to cover all forests. How do you resolve the difference in forest area coverage, and how do you ensure consistency or compatibility between these 2 assessments? Anyone is up for the question?
Well, I may start, but probably Sandro can complement, because we have a long history about these land-based, activity-based considerations. I mean, REDD plus our activities would happen in lands, let's say. So your greenhouse gas inventory, because you are all moving to land-based reporting in the greenhouse gas inventory, cover all your lands, meaning that it covers all the forest lands and the conversions to forest lands and from forest lands to something else. See, if you don't cover or don't take the 5 activities, therefore, what you report in your REDD annex is a subset of what your greenhouse gas inventory is, and therefore is not the same. But the consistency doesn't mean that the number has to be the same. The consistency, it means that you have to have the same source of data, the same selection of pools, the same, as far as possible, methodological approaches to do the estimations. So this is what consistency basically means when you compare to the greenhouse gas inventory. It doesn't mean that it has to be exactly the same name, but the same number. But obviously, as far as your subset of activities of REDD Plus are less than the 5 activities, you will have not the same number than in your greenhouse gas inventory. But again, consistency doesn't mean the same number. So I guess Sandro wants to add that.
What I may say is that if your reference level covers less than the total forest area, the best way is to have in the greenhouse gas inventory a subdivision. In a subdivision, you will report all forest areas that are included in the forest reference level, and the other subdivision, the area that has been excluded. In this way, you ensure the comparability of information. Comparability means also that sometimes the information are not totally identical, but my expectation is that they will be very likely identical, because for the reference level usually you have better information than for the greenhouse gas inventory, so then you may use that information to improve the greenhouse gas inventory.
Yeah, I guess if I can add what Sandro says, what is really important is that the exercise you're doing now for REDD Plus is really used for improving the future greenhouse gas inventories. And something which is also very interesting is what he said about putting separations. This means that in your greenhouse gas inventory you can have subcategories, right? So if you are smart enough to organize your subcategories in a way that allows people to map the REDD activities to it, then it becomes extremely transparent. I will put you an example. I mean, because in Annex 1, it was the same problem. The Kyoto Protocol activities were not land categories. So, for example, some countries were really having a subcategory which was really matching the deforestation, for example. And in that regard, it becomes quite transparent. So, and one possibility is to think very carefully how to stratify and define your subcategories within the land use categories of your greenhouse gas inventory for forest.
Okay, thank you, Maria and Sandro. So we have a second question to answer. What are the options for developing forest reference levels in countries with minimal or inconsistent historical data? Does regional historic data not allow for Tier 2 accuracy? Is it better to aim low with Tier 1 data?
But Leap, I see another, because they're asking for the difference between the term consistency and comparability.
No, that was related to the first part.
Okay.
Well, if you don't have the data for Tier 2, you submit Tier 1. Then, because the stepwise approach, what is expected that starting to monitor the land, you start to have much better data, and then you may revise the reference level using Tier 2 data. So, I guess this is...
If I may, I mean, for historical data, we consider the most important piece of information you need to collect first is your historical time series, so your forest cover change. And all countries have access to freely available Landsat imagery, which allow country to use national data. So, and that's what you see emerging in almost all REDD Plus countries at the moment. Almost every country is starting by analyzing historical time series of Landsat to assess forest cover change. Then it becomes a bit more tricky for carbon stock information, ground measurements. Some countries do not have very good historical data. In that case, as Sandro suggested, you may start with Tier 1, a Tier 1 approach using IPCC default value, maybe looking at scientific literature, etc.
Yeah. Yes, I would like to make sure that you understand the difference between the activity data and the emission factors, because I have the sense that sometimes people confuse that. I mean, activity data is subjected to approaches. You can have 3 approaches for identification of land, which is not tiers, it's something else. And in the 3 approaches, In the context of REDD+, people is trying to really use as much as possible approach 3, which is as much as possible wall-to-wall, right? But that's not the tier. The tier comes on the attribution of carbon of those changes, and this is the emission factors. Obviously, if you have not much information, if you don't have historical national forest inventories, for example, you will have much less information on your stocks, and therefore, probably, you may need to start with tier 1. You have several cycles of national forest inventories in the past, you may start thinking seriously on using tier 2 because you have enough information to make a much more accurate attribution of carbon to these area changes. Right? Tier 3 is something else, is a modeling approach. Right? So I would encourage you very much not to confuse first activity data and emission factors or attribution to the activity data and approaches for activity data, land identification with tiers for the attribution of carbon to the changes that you are detecting. So just to clarify, because I have the sense sometimes that people confuse those things very much.
Very much, Maria. Yes, please, Lucio.
No, just to complement also that in that cases where minimal information is available, it's important to take into account to maintain consistency also with the greenhouse gas inventory regarding the data for activity data and emission factors.
Can we add something else? Because another thing that is important is to understand that you don't apply necessarily tier 1 or tier 2 to the whole area. You can have areas where you can apply tier 2 and areas where you don't have enough information, or types of forests where you don't have enough information, and there you can use tier 1. So you can always move from tier 1 if you don't have anything to a combination of tier 1 and tier 2 if you start having information on certain type of forests or certain regions in the country, and then even move further to full tier 2 when you will have good information, several cycles for inventories in the whole country, for example.
Thank you all. We will move on to perhaps a last question. Then I suggest we move afterward to Giacomo's presentation, which may answer some of the questions you have. After which we'll reopen again. And perhaps just as a clarification, if you would like the name of your country mentioned in the questions you type, you may put in parentheses after your question which country you're from, so that countries perhaps may want to exchange with you or relate better to the context you're facing. So the last question relates to uncertainty and accuracy. So the question is, are there any recommendations related to having a high percentage of uncertainty or inaccuracy, or I guess a high percentage of accuracy for emission factors and activity data?
Okay, I can start, and then probably the statisticians can follow. Well, what is important is to know how much uncertainty you have. So it's important that you associate an uncertainty value to what you are estimating. Accuracy is a little bit more tricky because for estimating accuracy, you need to have several estimations to compare with, and then you can assess accuracy. I would say that as much as you can document your accuracy and your uncertainty, as much transparent you become, and as much robust and credible you may become. In the past, there's been a little bit of uncertainty analysis associated to these type of numbers, even in the case of an X1 country. So I would say be as much as possible providing estimations of uncertainty, and be as much as possible able to assess your accuracy. And this would be my recommendation. But perhaps Erika and Sandro can add to this.
I could just add that, especially for countries using maps, let me start. I could just add that there are differences between maps and estimates, and you may have maps from historic efforts of cartography or land cover mapping your country. You may have maps from satellite imagery. Those numbers that you produce from those maps have errors, and we know that, we understand that they have errors. The best way to quantify those errors is by including estimates of uncertainty with those numbers you report from the maps. You do that through a process of assessing the accuracy of the maps to a set of reference data which you consider to be the truth. The act of doing that accuracy assessment, comparing the map data to what you consider to be the truth, creates not only an accuracy assessment of that map, but it allows you to generate new estimates that you consider to be more robust than the estimates you get directly from the map. So new estimates of area of forest cover change, that sort of thing you can do through this process of accuracy assessment. And it's really important to acknowledge the fact that there are errors in the map products and that you can account for those through this process.
I would like also to highlight that uncertainty estimation is really a tool for countries in order to identify areas of improvement in the future estimations. Because uncertainty and accuracy is not matter of assessment in the frame of technical assessment before the UNFCCC. That is assessed is if the information provided by the country is accurate and transparent, that to let reconstruct the forest reference level.
Thank you, Lucio. If I may just add a point as well, in terms of, the questions mentioned specifically are their recommendations, and I'm assuming this refers to IPCC or UNFCCC recommendations. And the fact is, the IPCC, under the IPCC, it's a good practice to provide an uncertainty assessment of your data, and you can read this throughout the IPCC guidance and guidelines. But there are no specific accuracy thresholds that countries are supposed to meet under REDD+. Of course, countries want to be as accurate as possible, and as Lucio mentioned, performing an uncertainty assessment as a tool to identify areas of improvement and eventually provide more accurate data, but there are no specific thresholds that countries need to meet under the UNFCCC for REDD+. Okay, now I would suggest we move on with Giacomo Grassi's presentation. It will appear on, and then we will come back to some of the questions that just appeared. You'll see Giacomo Grassi's biography on your screen, and I guess as we mentioned earlier, Giacomo has been involved in the technical assessments of Brazil's forest reference emission level, and he will share in his presentation his experience with the technical assessments and provide some insights as to what the UNFCCC guidance actually mean for countries submitting their FREL. Again, if you'd like to see the presentation full screen, you can go to the top right of the presentation and be given the option to make it full screen.
Good morning to everybody. My name is Giacomo Grassi. In this presentation, I will provide an overview of the technical assessment process of the forest reference emission levels. After a short introduction, I will illustrate the objective and the scope of the technical assessment. I will provide some possible methodological advice, and I will conclude with some personal view. As you know, developing countries were invited to contribute to mitigation action by undertaking one or more of the following REDD activities. To this aim, countries were invited on a voluntary basis to submit proposed reference level or reference emission levels. What is a reference level? It is a benchmark for assessing the country performance in implementing REDD activities. Each reference level shall take into account historical data, possible adjustment for national circumstances, be national or as an interim measure subnational, be guided by IPC guidance, maintain consistency with the greenhouse gas inventory, include information that is transparent, accurate, complete, and consistent for the purpose of allowing a technical assessment of the data, be updated periodically to take into account new knowledge and methods. Finally, the reference level may be based on a stepwise approach to incorporate better data and additional pools. The guidelines for submission of information on reference level are included in the annex of Decision 12 CP 17. Essentially, the submission shall include historical data, transparent, complete, consistent, and accurate information on data and methods. To this regard, it is important to note that completeness in the REDD context means the provision of information that allow for the reconstruction of the reference level. Then the reference level submission shall include the pool, gases, and activities included, noting that significant pools and activities should not be excluded. And finally, the definition of forest used. Each proposed reference level shall be subject to a technical assessment by two LULUCF experts. The objective of technical assessment are to assess the degree to which information provided is in accordance with relevant COP decisions, to offer a facilitative technical exchange of information with the country with a view to support the capacity of the country to make future improvements. During technical assessment, the LULUCF expert will assess the following aspects: consistency with the greenhouse gas inventory, how historical data have been considered, the extent to which information is transparent, accurate, complete, and consistent, if reference level is national, subnational, any description of relevant policies, pool, gases, and activities included, and justification for omitted pools and activities, forest definition, and so on. Finally, the assessment team may identify areas for technical improvement and shall avoid any type of judgment on domestic policies. Here is a table prepared during the last round of technical assessment in Bonn. It aims to provide a quick overview of what is included in the proposed reference level. It shall be entirely based on the country submission, be factual and not include assessment. It could be part of future technical assessment report with the aim to provide a quick overview to any reader of what is included in the proposed reference level. According to relevant decisions, this is the timeline for the technical assessment. The entire process lasts 43 weeks. The most important step is the technical assessment week in Bonn. In the following slide, I will try to summarize some of the additional methodological advice that has been prepared in the context of a module of the GFOI mentioned in the lower part of the slide. This advice must not be seen as a must-do, but simply a possible suggestion on approaches to take in order to deal with requirements set by REDD decisions. Let's start with the consistency between REDD and inventory. The following element should be considered. The definition of forest and also the source of the activity data and emission factor should in principle agree between REDD and greenhouse gas inventory. If different exist, an explanation of the reason and rationale and the impact of this difference would help transparency. Then it is important that REDD activities are identifiable in the greenhouse gas inventories as a BC category or subcategories. And further stratification may be useful when REDD activity does not correspond to the whole inventory category, which may be a rather common case for REDD. In case of, for example, of subnational reference level, in case of when degradation is not exactly equal to forest land, remaining forest land, or in case when gross deforestation is determined as gross forest cover loss. It should be considered that consistency does not necessarily imply that coverage of the pools and gases in the area is the same because of the stepwise and subnational approach. Nevertheless, whenever differences exist, information on the reason for sure help the transparency. Let's move to significant pools and activities. What significant mean? And this is a very tricky and difficult issue. Here, I list possible and not mutually exclusive options that may be considered. A first approach would be to follow the EPC guidance for identifying key categories. In this case, a country could consider a pool significant if it accounts for more than 25 or 30% of emissions removals of the corresponding activity. But another criteria could be a set of rules intended to help the cost effectiveness and the conservativeness, which means that achievement of emissions reduction and removals enhancement will not be overestimated. In this case, the country could start by the most significant pool, responsible for the largest emission removal. Other pools can be considered as not significant in the sense that their exclusion is, for the moment, conservative if they behave in the same way as the most significant pool. If the pool behaved differently, then it could be considered potentially significant, to be included immediately or for future improvement as soon as possible. In practice, biomass, in case of deforestation in tropical biomass, is likely to be the most significant pools. Other pools often behave in the same way as biomass, but evidence should be provided. But there are exceptions. For example, soil organic carbon is very likely to be significant for forests planted on drained organic soils. Significance should often be rechecked as national monitoring system develops. Let's move to the activities for which we propose the same approach that we describe for pools. In this case, the cost effectiveness and conservativeness approach would mean that the country starts with the most significant activity. Then activity unlikely to be affected by displacement due to action on the most significant activity could be considered not significant in relation to the most important activity. On the other hand, activities which are likely to be affected by displacement would be considered potentially significant for inclusion at the same time as the most significant activity or for a prioritization, a stepwise approach. Evidence for displacement would include both qualitative and quantitative consideration, including proxy if relevant, for example, for assessing possible emission displacement from deforestation to degradation. The reference level may be improved with better data methodology, with the so-called stepwise approach. In this case, better data could be interpreted as allowing parties to start with the most significant activities and prioritize other potentially significant activities for the near future. Furthermore, subnational reference level may be elaborated as an interim step on the way of developing a national reference level. In this case, the National Forest Monitoring System should include monitoring reporting of emission displacement. It is a quite important issue to bear in mind when developing a reference level. In this slide, I will summarize some of the challenges and lessons learned, a very personal view. The technical assessment I joined up to now, have been a very intense and rewarding experience for me. I was very pleased to see how countries were willing to improve. When assessing, my personal view, it is unavoidably to note that some ambiguity in decision text makes sometimes difficult to understand the real meaning of the decision. For example, what significant pool and activity means. To what extent this concept should be framed in absolute terms, or to what extent should be framed within a stepwise approach. What to do when no information is available to assess significant pools and activity. This is a difficult situation for a technical assessor. How to consider possible risk of displacement between activities or in case of subnational reference level. How to consider consistency with inventory. Do we look to the last inventory or to the future one? This is important because often reference level includes better data and better methods than the previous greenhouse inventory. So often the consistency should be reassessed when the country submit a technical annex of the BUR. In all cases, conservativeness helps to prioritize effort. Even if it is not written in decisions, I think it's a useful concept for the country and for the technical assessor. Finally, it is important to frame any finding within a facilitative process which stimulates a continuous improvement. It should be never forgot that different countries start at different levels. It is a learning by doing process for everybody, the country and the LULUCF expert. Finally, it is impossible, of course, to check everything, but some element may help building trust and confidence. First of all, the country should document in a clear way how IPCC guidance has been followed and how, of course, the relevant decision text has been followed. The reproducibility of estimates is very important, including example of calculation and, when possible, allow access to the original information, especially activity data is important. Assessment of accuracy at the appropriate level. So if you report deforestation, the assessment of accuracy should be done for forest land use change, not for the land use only. Finally, verification activities would be useful. Sensu IPCC, which means a comparison of the country estimates with a partially or fully independent estimate with the aim to provide input and build confidence on estimates and trend. Of course, care should be paid to identify a meaningful comparison, which not always is easy. And I conclude with some example of possible comparisons. On emission factor, one may look at the IPCC default factor, but here pay attention to the fact that aggregation is at continental scale and limits the utility of this comparison. But also the IPCC emission factor database can be useful. There are well-known publications by Sacchi and another publication by Baccini on pantropical above-ground biomass maps. And another publication which aggregate these data sets per ecological zone and country and plus confidence interval. I think this publication may be useful to look at. For activity data, there has been quite a lot of discussion on the utility of Hansen dataset, which is easily downloadable at country level. The limits of a comparison of Hansen dataset with reference level is that Hansen data comes from a global level analysis, and the accuracy is not expected to be as good as the one potentially achievable by country level analysis. In most cases, estimates are not fully comparable because Hansen report only a 3 canopy cover change. Reference level is about deforestation, and the things are not exactly the same. An example include palm oil plantation, often not considered forest by countries but seen as forest by these global data sets. Nevertheless, I think that for specific forest types, for example, dense humid forest, if the country report estimates of gross deforestation based on gross forest cover loss, then the comparison with Hansen or other global data set could make sense. With this, I have concluded, and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, well, I do hope you enjoyed this presentation by Giacomo Grassi. As I mentioned earlier, and perhaps for those of you who joined in late, Giacomo unfortunately could not be here live with us, so we'll not be able to answer directly to questions you may have about these presentations, but hopefully with all the expertise we have around the table and connected in Mexico, we can answer those questions. So there are a few questions that popped up during the previous question session. There was one from Uganda on emission factor, and it goes as such: supposing that the last time a country carried out the forest inventory was about 15 years ago. would this data still be relevant if there has been some forest degradation happening since? Anyone wants to go at it?
Well, emission factors are related to the characteristics of the forest you're considering. So you can use emission factors related to saying this is an intact or quasi-intact forest. So obviously, you're suspecting that 15 years later, this forest is not intact. In this area, in this particular area, you cannot use the same emission factors. You have to look for a new one, but or sort of understand what process of degradation was and how much the stocks were degraded. But emission factors per se, when you attach to a particular type of forest, are values that are related to this type of forest. When you don't have processes of degradation, so that it's a more or less intact forest. I would say the data is valuable. Yes, it is valuable. I will explain an example. For example, in the case of Brazil, they did the carbon map, right? And in the carbon map, based on a one-time survey of lots of plots, they sort of classified in volumes, geographically distance. And then they found out that for the same type of forest, they were different stocks because closer to the border of the forest, there was more degradation, and therefore the stocks were less. So this is the sort of considerations that you have to have. If you use a plain emission factor coming from an inventory, you have to be aware that you may be committing some errors if there are being some processes of degradation in the forest. But if you have no possibility at this point in time to detect that, well, you just need to sort of include that consideration in your uncertainty, sort of. But emission factors is an emission factor attached to a certain qualities of a certain forest type, and that's what it is. It's no, and degradation is a process that can happen there. So you have evidence of that. You need to sort of take into account that when you attribute the carbon in this particular stand. But Sandro has more expertise than I do.
You have been enough is enough.
Lucio, did you have anything to add?
No, really.
I guess not. Okay. We will go on with the next question. And it goes as such. Would the benchmark for uncertainty of MAP products come from, instance, from an NFI? Where is true data typically found to estimate uncertainty? I guess Eric will answer that one.
Yes, that's a really good question. I think we all know that truth is, well, we get a bit into philosophy at this point, but I mean, truth is very difficult to come by anyway. So what we have to say is truth are the best available data we have. An NFI is completely suitable for truth, for assessing the accuracy of a map. The issues we have with using NFIs for assessing map accuracy is typically the fact that NFIs and the time that the NFI is measured and the time that the map is created are often not the same. So that makes it difficult to assess at the same time the accuracy of the map with that particular data that represents truth. If we have a map from a certain time period and an NFI from another time period, if we use the NFI to assess the accuracy of that map, what we are actually doing are generating estimates for the time period of the reference data. So if we have a map from 1990 and an inventory from year 2000, what we're doing is actually creating an estimate for year 2000 and not actually helping ourselves out with the 1990 accuracy assessment. In the case of truth for assessing accuracy of historic maps, then we have to use we'd likely have to use some sort of remotely sensed reference data, whether that's aerial photography, higher spatial resolution satellite images, or for that matter, in the worst case scenario, using the same images that were used to create the map as possible, with a more careful interpretation. If we take more time and we are more careful with our interpretations, that qualifies as truth in the worst case scenario. So I guess we do the best we can with what we have. We have different levels of idealness, I guess, with most ideal being a coincidentally timed inventory with map creation. The next best ideal being high spatial resolution imagery of some sort, not of a higher quality than that was used to make the map. And then finally we get down to using the same data we used to make the map, but with more careful interpretations. I hope that answers the question.
Very well. Anyone else? I guess we were expecting a more curious audience. We have no more question on the board, and we still have some time. So we invite again participants to ask a question on the board, so we can continue. And if there are no more questions, I guess we'll wrap things further.
Do you want me to answer Carlos's question about more careful interpretation?
Yeah,
Sure, maybe.
Okay, sorry if that's not clear. More careful interpretation. In many cases, maps are created either through an automated process or through, even if they're created with by hand, let's say. We often don't have the time to focus on the exact location of every single exact location in the map at the same time. We get tired making the map, or the automated process. The maps are so big that we don't have enough time to focus on the locations, on every single location. So with an accuracy assessment, it's generally done on a sample-based strategy. So you select tiny little locations all around the map area to analyze. When we select only a tiny little area to look at, usually we can do that with a little bit more care than we did when we created the map in the first place. And that's what I mean by more careful. You take the time, you look at only one area, and you do the best that you can. Oh, by the way, it should also be done independently. So the person that makes the map should not be the person that estimates the accuracy or generates the estimates from that map. Because as everybody knows, your maps are perfect to you. I hope that answers it, Carlos.
Sandro, you had something else?
Well, my comment is more general about benchmark for uncertainty. I guess we should say there is the accuracy issue. Accuracy means that you don't have systematic errors. The systematic errors must be avoided always. So you have to, if you find some systematic error, you must eliminate it with methodological, there are methodologies to do that. You may correct, because a systematic error means that there is an error, for in the case of maps, there is an error in the classification methodology. Then there are the uncertainties around random errors. Random errors means that you have to do your best to reduce as far as possible, but there is not a benchmark, there is not also a threshold that should be achieved or not. The threshold is the practicability of the solution you should implement to reduce the uncertainty. About the map, maybe Eric will be not so happy with what I'm saying, but In general, I don't like the map. So my suggestion is don't use map for studying land use changes. Use instead, as also Eric advised, because I read the GFI, use instead the images. So if you want to compare something to check if something is changed, instead to compare the map, maybe you may directly compare the images and look at the changes in the images, and then study if the changes in the images means that something is changed, because there could be seasonality, could be clouds, could be whatever else reason. It could be also the management cycle. The forest has been harvested, but because it was harvested, it's not a deforestation, and so on. So that's my general advice for the uncertainty.
I guess if I can.
Yeah, please.
I mean,
It doesn't make me unhappy.
the objective of doing a map on one point in time is to see what is the status at that point in time.
Of course.
If you want to see the changes, as Sandro and Eric are indicating, it's better to focus on the changes themselves, because it's less work than comparing two points in time that are done sometimes for other purposes, and therefore it probably more cost efficiency. And I'm not an expert, but what I've been seeing is that it's far more easy to focus on reducing uncertainties when you evaluate the changes, than when you try to reduce uncertainties in one map, uncertainties in another map, and then you still have uncertainties when you compare the maps. So if you focus on the change, you just need to deal with one uncertainty, which is the uncertainty of the change. So that probably it is, for a non-expert, what it really convinced me about how to do things.
Okay. Thank you both for those comments. And Sandro, I'm not upset. In fact, I agree. But for me, it's again on the scale of like, you have the ideal, which is comparing image to image. If all you have are historic maps, it is possible. It's not maybe the best case scenario, but it may be the only thing that you have to deal with. A map subtraction is okay if you follow it up with a properly done accuracy assessment of the changes created by the map subtraction. If you do the accuracy assessment of a map, the area of change generated from a map subtraction or comparison of two maps, you will generate an estimate of change with confidence intervals which are wider than you would generate if you generated change in some other way. But you would still generate a valid estimate of change, just the confidence intervals would be wider.
Yeah.
So that's a trade-off.
I guess another point is, Maria, another point you have to take into account is that you have multiple maps down. Obviously, I mean, there is, and it will be important that you look into these maps, because it's an alternative source of information. So either way, you base on those maps and do what Eric is saying, which will generate probably bigger confidence intervals. Or you decide to go directly to evaluate the changes, but then you will have still these maps. So you will have to understand why those maps are, subtraction is different from, because somebody can do it also. So, and that's what I was trying to say in my introduction, that it is very important to try to understand or build upon what you already have in order to be able to defend either way what you are doing on the top of that, or if you are changing to something else, because the other people will probably be exposed to the same information. So, and I guess it is not looking for the best ideal, most efficient methodology directly, but you also have some baggage in your bag, which are maybe some maps, and everyone will look at those maps. And some people can say, well, why you didn't use those maps? So you have to look into all these things and then decide what is the most cost efficient in this moment in time for you to move. And maybe the most cost efficient is to use the maps because you have them. But then on the path for improvement, you may consider to change towards something which is more directly assessing the changes.
If I have one more thing. And it goes to something, this is Eric again, it goes to something I said earlier about the difference between estimates of activity data or forest cover change and maps. And what is important, I think, are the estimates. So generating a proper estimate is the most important thing. A map we use for cartography, which is also important, but I think we have a bit more leeway and a bit more time with our maps than we do with our estimates. So we can generate estimates with data we have quite efficiently through the process of assessing the accuracy. Our maps we can take some time with. We can improve them over time. We can generate better cartographically precise maps for those areas, especially those areas in which we have projects where we want to monitor them very carefully from a map standpoint. So maps and estimates, they're different. Maps are for cartography, estimates are for reporting.
Very well, thank you so much. I guess we want to go with the next question.
Okay, so let me take then the next question. First, we had a question from John Begumana, and then we will go to a question from Mexico. So on guidance from carbon finance mechanisms on how to deal with uncertainties, the real technical guidance is found in the IPCC, first of all, but there's additional guidance in GovC Gold and GFOI. So real technical guidance on how to reduce uncertainties is not found in, for example, the Carbon Fund methodological framework, which gives specific guidance on how to construct a reference level if you would like to participate in the Carbon Fund. Now, they do provide some guidance on how to deal with these uncertainties. So what they propose is that a certain share of emission reductions will be located in a buffer, and these will not be accredited. So this is one way of how finance, if that answers the question, like how carbon finance mechanisms offer a specific guidance. And then the top there is, I think it's a 15% reduction. Somebody wants to add something on this question?
Well, maybe if I could add, the question specifically mentioned, do other carbon financing mechanisms offer guidance on allowable errors? I guess not specifically on how to reduce errors, as Marike said. There are some voluntary, I guess, carbon mechanism. For instance, the verified carbon standard, the VCS, in some of your countries might have VCS projects within your national boundaries. This particular standard offers guidance on acceptable accuracy or accuracy thresholds that projects should reach, and that might be fine at a small scale for projects, for instance. Applying these types of accuracy thresholds for large areas, for subnational areas, or for national coverage becomes quite complex, particularly for countries that have limited data, that might have old maps being used to produce a change assessment. And I guess my point is that those guidance that may be available in other carbon financing mechanism may be difficult to apply in the context of REDD+. We recommend countries to go back to the IPCC guidance to reduce measurement errors, for instance, and other tools like Marike mentioned, the GovC Gold or GFOI guidance. So maybe just not to lose our or train of thoughts on the map. There was a question from Ethiopia pertaining to the question just before, wondering whether the maps used to do estimates could be different than the ones used to do cartography. Which is a good question. I guess I'll refer this one back to Eric one more time.
Oh, that's a really good question. And I think what I can say, I think some of this stuff is still being worked out, really. I mean, I think it's possible to do that, yes. So you can make a map, you can assess the accuracy of that map. Through that process, you generate estimates. Those estimates are the things you can report. So long as you can tell the story about where those estimates come from in an open and transparent manner, I think that will work just fine. The point of the map, you can update the cartography of the map. The cartography of the map should not actually affect the estimates, the central tendency of the estimates you generate. Improved cartography may decrease the confidence, may improve the confidence interval, improve the precision of those estimates, but it should not change the estimates in any sort of major way. So if you have a reasonable map and a good accuracy assessment, you will generate good estimates. Any improvements you make to the map will, in theory, should only serve to improve the precision of those estimates, but should not change in any drastic way the estimates you submit.
Thanks, Eric. And I may add to this a little bit. In most countries, there are different kind of maps available. Some are made, by national technicians and experts. Other maps have been produced, perhaps even without your knowledge, by international organization experts. The case of the Congo Basin is a good one. There are several maps that have been produced by different parties over the years. In certain occasions, also change estimates have been produced. But a lot of countries moving forward with their reference level are producing other maps and also using different methodologies for their change estimates. When they will submit their reference level, they have to decide which estimates they will be using, and perhaps which map they will be providing to the technical assessment as maybe the reference map they'll be using. Those maps will be different than other products that are available out there. Sometimes they may be other national products produced, for instance, by another ministry, another agency.
Can I add to this, because I think the point is that cartographical exercises are done for different objectives. So if you do a map for a particular objective where you don't need that, uncertainty is not a big issue, or accuracy is less relevant, you do it for that purpose. So, and therefore, what is really important is to make sure that you can always go back to the original information that was used for making the map. And that's why, okay, you can compare maps, but the maps have to be done for the purpose that you want to do the comparison for. Otherwise, you may compare maps which are not done for that purpose. And therefore, your errors are much bigger related to the objective that you want to identify or the change you want to identify. So, and I understand that the countries are struggling with the fact that there are cartographic units in the ministers or cartographic unit which serves several ministers. And these guys have to do maps for almost anything. And therefore, they have to adapt those exercises to the purpose. So what perhaps is extremely important is that more and more, when you need a service, you do or you request that the service is done on the basis of the data, of the original data where maps are coming from, where different cartographic exercises are coming from. which comes back to the images that we have available. That could be
Sorry, it's a telephone, not a techno party. Okay, maybe we can move on to the other question by a colleague from Mexico, which is a very good one. So Mexico is using a stock change approach to report its FREL to the UNFCCC. At the same time, Mexico is testing modeling that use a gain-loss approach to better attribute the impact of different disturbances of greenhouse gas fluxes. In your opinion, what would be the best way to combine or use the information provided by the gain-loss approach while ensuring consistency with the estimates of the FREL?
Simple answer. Simple answer, you use for verification. That's it.
but I guess the two methods provide you different sorts of insights. Carbon stock just compare 2 points in time, but doesn't rely on what led these carbon stocks should change. Just compare. In the case of gain and losses, you introduce some more information about how this happened, right? So using gains and losses is not that it's better or worse. As Sandro said, you could use one or the other for verification. With the gains and losses for you in domestic work, it provides you a little bit more of insight of how this change in stock happened in this particular unit. So I would say that you cannot mix them, or you should not mix them, let's say, but you could do both, and both can really provide you relevant information and can be used to compare them so that you can see if you are really off, and you can verify a bit your value. You will never get exactly the same value, but I mean, if you get 3, 4, or 5 or 6 orders of magnitude difference, and you suspect that something is wrong in one of both. So that's what I would say. So for reporting, you can use stock change. It's not a problem. You could, as Sandro says, use gain loss for validation, and later on in the future, if you get more confident with your gain and losses, or you have more resources, because usually gains and losses are more resource intensive, or you have also to make initially some assumptions depending on how you do it. So that's I think my reflection on that. Mareike wants to say something.
Yes, I just briefly wanted to add there. I'm fully agreeing with the other panelists, and I think this additional information gathered by this other methodology may be very important for domestically, for understanding, for a better understanding of what is going on, and may very well feed into your strategy, for example. But you should be careful not to use it in reporting to avoid any inconsistency in numbers and a mix of methodologies. Lucio, do you want to add something?
No, Mareike, I completely agree with you. I think that in some way this approach could be complementary in the sense that the gain and loss approach that is mentioned.
Question.
Yes.
Okay, I guess Ethiopia has, I guess, an additional clarification on the mapping process related to the point before. We may want to use the land use land cover data for change detection. However, we may not have information about the accuracy information of past historical data. And then be confident to let these data to be processed or change detection. I guess it's a bit more of a comment than a question. Perhaps Melekina would invite you to connect with Eric Lindquist after the webinar if you have additional I guess queries about this. There's a question from Liberia and it's a good practical one. In reference to the maps used to produce historical time series, I believe, what is your professional advice, especially for countries that have recruited firms to produce maps for REDD Plus activities?
I think, this is Eric, I think again that no matter who created the map, I mean, our goal ideally at FAO and within this team is to build the capacity or to help the national ministries make the estimates, build the maps, that sort of thing, so that it can be continued long term. But no matter who makes the map, no matter where the product comes from, you have the power to turn that map into estimates. And you do that through the process of assessing the accuracy of the map. So if somebody gives you a map, if you like it, or if that is the method you've set up for generating those data, if somebody gives you a map, it's your responsibility or your ability to assess the accuracy of that map. And when you do that, if you do it carefully and do it well, you will generate statistically reasonable estimates from that product. And then it becomes yours at that point. Those numbers that you generate from that exercise become your numbers, no matter who provided you with the map. I hope that helps.
I may add just an addition. Yes, you have to ask the firm to verify your maps. Then, in this way, you evaluate the accuracy. But you should also ask the firm to verify when you combine the two maps for calculating land use changes. Because very often the map have systematic errors. There are no random errors usually. There are errors of classification. These systematic errors, they do not cancel out when you combine the maps. They magnify usually. So you have to ask the firm to verify the maps, but also the land use changes calculated by combining the maps. If you pay them. So.
Yeah, the change is important.
If you don't pay them.
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay, I guess we have time perhaps to take 2 more questions at most before we wrap up this first webinar. So we'll invite everyone perhaps, or those of you that have not yet asked questions, if you have some burning ones. Again, those of you that have not asked a question, okay, well, unless someone, I guess, quickly mentions that they have a question, we could slowly close up this webinar. I would invite perhaps the panelists, if you have any, last perhaps guidance or advice to countries. We use these last couple of minutes to conclude.
Yeah, but I guess it would be very nice to know from you if you found this seminar useful, and if it's worth that we continue a series of seminars, maybe focusing on topics, so that we can focus the discussions more. The other thing that I think we all concur is that this is a process. The construction of a reference level is a process that encompasses several decisions that you have to take, and I emphasize you have to take as countries. But you have to understand the implications of the decisions that you are taking and how you could easily move towards something better. And this is how this stepwise approach in the context of reference levels has to be understood. On those decisions, it's very important that you try to build your credibility in the system, so that your estimations become more and more credible, and therefore your initial decisions are very critical. I won't put concrete examples, but for example, in general terms, what activity you choose in relation of the significance of this activity and how this is going to be perceived by anyone that can look data in relation to that in your country, it is an important consideration. Sometimes this is related, or your selection is related to the best data you have, but you have also to understand that there are activities where you may not have best data, but the significance of this activity is extremely important. So at least you have to indicate that, even if you don't have enough information to provide good estimates for that particular activity. So it's better to recognize those things early on, even if you don't include them, and indicate that you are going to look for those things seriously in the future, that just blindly say, I select this activity because I have best data for this activity, and because I don't have enough data for other activities, I just don't. So indicate in your reference level submission also this path of improvement in relation to these considerations.
Thank you very much, María José. I guess I'd like to thank all panelists for taking the time to be with us today and answering questions that the audience had. We do hope you found it useful. I would like to recall to everyone that the UNREDD program provides support to countries for better understanding requirements on constructing reference levels, and direct country supports to assist countries in constructing and submitting their reference level. We have done several trainings in various countries, regional trainings as well, and we are assisting a number of countries at the moment who are willing to submit to the next round, to the next call for reference level. And if you do have queries, specific needs, Marike right now is writing the email address of all the panelists. If you do have specific needs from the UNREDD program to provide support on FRELs, you can address those needs directly to Marike and myself, and we will make sure that those are channeled to the appropriate people within the UNREDD program. Please feel free to communicate. If you have direct questions to the panelists, all the email addresses will pop up. We do assist countries as part of their national programs, but for those countries that do not have national programs, we also have the targeted support modality. If you're interested in knowing, having more information about targeted support for reference level, please contact Marike and myself, and we will make sure to answer your query quickly.
Yeah, in addition to what Philippe said, the program supports, we are also very interested in, if you have any intention to share among yourselves, among countries in a particular region, we'll be very happy to support that exchange of information. Particularly if there are countries which are more advanced, they already submitted, and they want to share their experiences with neighboring countries. That, of course, is something that we will be very, very much keen to support as well.
If there are no additional comments, I guess we will thank you all and wish you a very pleasant day. All right. Bye, everyone.